And so, here we are. It's been a long journey, but we're finally at the end of part 2. The bittersweet and final point I want to end on here, the one that I think is perfect to wrap up part 2 of this series, is that at the end of the day, pure realism just is not that popular on its own. In part 1 and previous videos, I mentioned some important concepts relating to this. For today, I'm going to be using several terms from those videos, so if anything sounds strange, that is where to look. As an example of what I mean, we have seen this play out, this thing with technical realism, many times, well beyond just mecha or anime. 2001: A Space Odyssey was a movie that still shines as a wonderful example of tough, realistic space vehicles, space settlements, and in general deep space exploration. But 2001 is more than simply a tech demo for what-if spacecraft. To the Americans living through the height of the space race in the 1960s, 2001 was a veritable window into tomorrow. It showed them their own supposed future, so the mechanism here remains the same. Use technical realism as a bridge for believability, thus, suspension of disbelief, then finally, for the full engrossing investment of the audience. Now this is not to downplay the technical work that went into making that film. It was a lot of effort. But to once again show that it is a part of a larger machine that is the relative realism of the story. Likewise, just like real machines, that one part can be bigger and stronger, that technical realism can power a beefy, hard science fiction relative realism story like 2001, or you could have a zippy space adventure film where the technical realism only ever needs to be aesthetically skin deep, because the relative realism just has to carry the adventure and narrative of the story, and that's it, period. Moving back to Mecha, this does leave us with the start of the video. So you have your technical realism. Okay, got it. Hell, you have all these different kinds of realism, right? And we know you can have all different kinds of relative realism built from that, powering all these different kinds of stories off those things. But this leaves us with a big question. If we tune up as many of these factors as possible, if we really emphasize technical realism, if we really want to make the most realistic, really real mecha show, does it even equate to popularity? Does it even equate to narrative quality? The simple answer is
nope, heck no.
This is maybe the biggest fucking irony to the very same morons who took real and super robots super seriously and tried to parade their elitism over those dumb super robot fans. This whole simplification is just whack. This whole dichotomy is just whack. This whole system of value is just fucking stupid. And most of all, as much as technically minded nerds, and trust me, I am an extremely technically minded nerd, might obsess over this, the answer is still, ultimately, no. I can think of no better way of highlighting this than to go through some perfect examples from within Mecha itself. Gundam here is a wonderful example. Gundam is popular. It exploded into cultural significance, right? It triggered this huge Mecha franchise. And here, I have seen, and no, this is not a rhetorical argument, I have seen people use this as a claim of how realism meant better serious stories and popularity. But like so many things, the truth is that it's only 100% relative. Both in terms of the relative realism that Gundam used, and in terms of, like, when it came out? What Gundam really did, what it did phenomenally well, was two things that, yes, Star Wars also did. Number 1, tap into the general zeitgeist. Realism here is completely irrelevant. Gundam in 2001 used a pro-technology, pro-high-tech approach with technical realism, as we went over, as a means of making it believable. Wow, real O'Neill colonies! Wow, real zero gravity! But what was Gundam doing with these things? It was mixing them with 18-meter giant rainbow robots. It is ostensibly an extremely high-low mix of technical realism. Mostly bullshit giant man-shaped robot suits, mixed with some practically NASA-certified space colony designs. And here's the thing though, zeitgeist is entirely fucking relative. When there was a huge gas crunch on, the Road Warrior and Mad Max tapped into that zeitgeist of a depressing, crazy, primitive dystopia. It had people reverting from any kind of fancy technology to what they could essentially weld together. It played off of how people felt and how people approached technology. Likewise, Star Wars exploded from zeitgeist, but it was specifically not focused on any science or technology. That's what did it. It was entirely focused on its adventure. So while Gundam had it, and it's still hugely relative to how Gundam was successful, zeitgeist is a moving, changing thing. It's not inherently pro or anti-technology or technical realism. And now for number 2. Number 2 is innovate. Yeah, that's right, innovate. That's the thing that Gundam and Star Wars did. You know, as in creatively, in the 1970s you had copious amounts of depressing fucking SF movies. We Will Have to Eat People world, Murder Race world, Old People Die world, Flying Killhead Red Thong world. Lucas here brought back a fun form of adventure story set in space and using the modern special effects of the day to make a great version of that. But that was itself innovative, just not doing another depressing 70s SF film. Even Lucas himself had already made a previously depressing SF movie in that style. THX 1138 was the same as those other depressing movies. It was mainly that it just made a fun, new kind of story out of an older style. Lucas and the many creative people around him worked hard to effectively renew things. Gundam here was the same. It was not that Gundam removed the fun of Mecha or really made them all that less super bullshit. It's that by using technical realism and military realism, Tomino, who was already making works in that direction, innovated and pushed it further than it had been before. So what we see here is that being pro-technical realism, being pro-reality and believable machines, pro-hard SF or anti-hard SF, do not in themselves matter all that much. If realistic science responds to people's hopes and ideas, then that works. If it gets in the way, then it gets in the way. Ultimately, responding to people's desires with realistic technology and creative innovation is more important for determining if a work is a huge hit than just if the science does or does not work out. Duh. Okay, so that's a bigger example, but let's come back to what I started part 2 with. Patlabor. Patlabor to me is this beautiful thing exactly because of how much it and its creator, Mamoru Oshii, are chameleons. Patlabor has wonderful technical realism, as we have been over, but that realism was likewise, like Gundam, a reflection of riding the zeitgeist. Riding the wave of Japan's booming tech industry and industrialization, but this also ironically came back to bite it in the ass. When Japan's economy went tits up, this all went away. This is in part why Patlabor's second movie is so serious. To the extent that some people who only watched the, kill wyvern scene on YouTube might be forgiven for mistaking it for an entirely different grim military series. This is what it looks like when times change and a series is allowed to creatively adapt to them. When you have wonderfully talented directors like Oshii who can make the most of that change in the wind. Oshii always enjoyed both wacky elements and serious realistic ones. Patlabor is a veritable execution of that. But here the realism is once again, yes, just a tool. A very nice tool, and something that you should use, but it's ultimately relative. When the economy is booming and everything is fun and games, Oshii can do fun and games. But when Japan starts getting a little expansion-y and the economy is fucked and the world seems directionless, Oshii can do that as well. Ultimately, the supreme realism and beauty of Patlabor as a series, and Patlabor 2 in particular, is derived from that reflection of reality. This is Oshii driving manual stick in Patlabor's narrative car. And so, as we can kind of see, neither Gundam nor Patlabor, both series addressed as pinnacles of that annoying thing, that dumb thing called Real Robot, nor any mecha show automatically gained some huge popularity bonus just from technical realism. It got a boost from smartly using realism in the right way for both. Okay, so I know that's a lot of theoretical shit, but there is a logical point someone might ask because of that. But Argenbolt, if it's a matter of using realism smartly, then isn't that the same thing? Okay, sure, you can get it wrong, it doesn't help, but so long as you add technical realism in the right way, it's got to be a positive for popularity, right? It should, realism should be good. Just realism plus do it right equals popular. Well, the answer, and probably the saddest answer I can give, and one that can be proven here by addressing the negatives, is the inverse, is that that's just not true. There are many cases where using realism and technical realism ultimately meant not a bonus, but a severe penalty. Because oh baby, not only has it has happened to some of the mecha things I love most. It might be why I like them so much. Like right up front, let's go back to the thing I mentioned in the second episode of this series, Steel Battalion. Like there's nothing metaphorical here at all. Its giant, huge, detailed, button-encrusted controller does make that game feel more realistic by giving you the total depth and breadth of a mecha's controls. But it also costed a pretty fucking penny back then, and hundreds of bucks right now to even just get the game, not even to play it. Its realistic approach was its own biggest barrier for entry. Its own creative use of technical realism is what nailed it as something that was always going to be a niche product. Then look at Chrome Hounds. Now, Armored Core was not a massive series in terms of popularity, but it was pretty well known, and it was generally well known as FromSoft's main mecha game. It used a more liberated and closer to Gundam or Macross kind of rapid combat that is just inherently quite fun. But in terms of technical and military realism, Chrome Hounds was well and above any of the Armored Cores. In many ways, it was a game for a niche audience of an already niche audience. For people like me who love mecha, but also love the challenge and absurdity of constraining mecha with more true-to-life limitations. It was never going to be as popular as Armored Core because of that. And Gun Griffin, oh man, oh my precious baby, my precious little Type 12. Beyond being stuck on a console with wacky controllers, its approach was always niche. In many ways, Gun Griffin was responding to Patlabor's own use of hyper-grounded, technically realistic mecha, addressing them not as special vehicles on their own, but simply powerful military machines. But then, look at Gun Griffin Blaze. Already, the Patlabor mill realism has been stripped out. We have returned to Gundam's style mix, panoramic cockpits and big arcade visuals, power-ups, and so on. It's fun, but the level of realism and vision for Gun Griffin that had existed with the first two games, unfortunately, passed on with Takeshi Miyagi. It would not be until Grape, the fan creator who basically had to build and code from scratch GGsim, that something would actually live up to that original vision. And this is the larger reality, really. Without creative vision, without drive to make and use technical realism, even popularity aside, art tends to trend back to a comfortable mix of these elements, back to where general audiences expect it to be, because in many ways, too much realism is a hard barrier. To get military realism, you need to know military history and theory. To understand horticultural realism, you should probably do some of your own gardening. To notice costume period issues, you should probably know or do costume work, or know historical clothing. The naturally specialized way our society does jobs mean you just cannot count on everyone to be able to notice all the little details in every piece of specific art by default. It's just not reasonable. And I think nothing sums this up more than an anime called Flag. Flag is hands down perhaps one of the most broadly, quote, realistic mecha shows I know of. Everything from its journalist viewpoint to its simple narrative devoid of most of the usual grandiose mecha story elements. But the thing is, nothing I think proves my point more than I've never seen all of Flag. Yeah, I know this is weird to admit this, but this is kind of a perfect example. I've seen dozens upon dozens upon dozens of shows. But here's the thing. Flag's own creative use of technical realism, and all other sorts of realism, is a huge barrier. You have to know, and like at least some combination of mecha or current events, contemporary history, geopolitics, journalism, or something, to get these very grounded stories, to get the most out of them. To get the most out of Flag. And while I have watched the first 2 episodes about 2 times trying to watch all of it, I've never finished that series. I needed personally to learn and grow, and simultaneously learn more and more about the world as a person, while not letting go and still enjoying mecha. I had to come up to Flag's level. It was not going to pander to me to simply suck me in. I had to be a patient and willing audience member for its artistic approach. And for many people, that's simply too much of a demand. As I am writing, recording, and ultimately making the very video you are watching right now, I am finally watching it, finally watching all of Flag for reference for part 3 of this series. But I think that kind of shows a great example in and of itself. Because a work like Flag, once you have those criteria, is just so much more damn enjoyable. They are works built on top of information it assumes the audience has. On top of all the realism, the military realism and technical realism that you can now start to begin to appreciate. These kind of works are just inherently built deeper down within their respective genres or media forms, and are like wonderful little time capsules for people like me. Which is also why, sadly, when I say things like Mecha's creative output is in decline, these kinds of shows are almost always some of the first to vanish. Things broadly get rough for Patlabor, and worse for Gundam, but for neat little shows like Flag, their environmental niche up and disappears. Their barrier for entry and their adherence to a creative use of technical realism strands them firmly in the "this is not profitable enough for us to give a damn" category within big corporations like Sunrise. But hey, I mean, at least YouTube/Netflix/Amazon will throw money at shit now. So as you can kindly generally see, realism and technical realism are, have, and will always be creative tools. Tools which require fierce and demanding output from their creators, but also often enough a certain degree of investment from their viewers as well. On its own, there is simply no certified, absolute link to say that any of them will result in a better show, let alone a popular or mega successful show either. Now! Enough! I have talked, and talked, and talked. Now it is time to show. I have illustrated and spoken on many things. I have talked about my views. I have shown that I know all the reasons Mecha is not real, and all the hopes and potential for how it may be real as well. I have shown both sides of the argument, but now is no longer the time for merely argument. Now is the time to lead by example. A true test. I must be the artist, be the change I hope to see in the system. I must create. Part 3, The Revenge of Mecha, will not merely be a video, but a story. A Mecha story. The first Mecha story I may be proud of making. If Mecha is real or not. To hell with those speakers, those who do not create. If Mecha is in decline, or not in decline, all to hell with them. Mecha is a feeling. It is power. It is a style of story. If it is to survive, if it is to continue, it requires new blood. And if it needs it, I shall give it some of my own. Maybe I will succeed in making a good story. Maybe I will fail. But either way, for Mecha, I will move forward. Mecha, which has been the wind of hot life in my lungs. I owe it this much. From the throne of the humanoid machine, I will charge destiny itself.